Shock doesn't even begin to describe the moment when a sitting National Director of Public Prosecutions found herself verbally cornered by a judge whose questions cut sharper than any cross-examination she had likely faced before. Because in that room, under oath, authority was no longer assumed. It had to be earned in real time, and for the first time in a long while, South Africans watching closely sensed that the person meant to embody prosecutorial certainty was suddenly searching for solid ground. What followed next was not just another tense legal exchange, but a slow, deliberate unraveling of confidence, as Justice Nkabinde's line of questioning began to expose uncomfortable gaps between public assurances and institutional realities, forcing advocate Shamila Batohi to confront the difference between leading an office and commanding trust, a difference that would define every minute of the inquiry that followed. From the very first moments after that shock, it became clear that this inquiry was not about a single decision or a lone delay, but about an entire system being held up to the light, with Batohi standing at its center, asked to explain not only what had been done, but why so many South Africans felt justice itself had stalled under her watch, a question that hung heavy in the room and refused to be brushed aside. As the hearing progressed, the tone shifted from formal procedure to something far more probing, almost surgical, as Justice Nkabinde pressed on issues of leadership, oversight, and responsibility, challenging the NDPP to reconcile her public image as a reformer with the lived experience of a prosecution service, struggling to deliver decisive outcomes in the country's most high-profile cases. There was a moment early on when Batohi spoke about complexity, about inherited challenges, about institutional decay predating her tenure, and yet the response from the bench made one thing unmistakably clear: explanations without accountability were no longer sufficient, especially in a country where delayed justice has become a familiar wound rather than an abstract concept. The inquiry room itself seemed to mirror the national mood, tense but attentive, as every answer was weighed not only for legal adequacy but for moral clarity, because this was no longer a conversation confined to statutes and procedures. It was a public reckoning with expectations placed on the office of the NDPP. Justice Nkabinde's questioning did not come across as hostile, but it was relentless in its precision, returning repeatedly to timelines, decision-making processes, and internal controls, almost as if to say that leadership is revealed not in grand statements, but in the unglamorous details of follow-through and consequence. And it was in those details that discomfort surfaced, because when pressed on specific delays and internal failures, the responses often leaned on collective processes and systemic burdens, prompting the judge to probe deeper into whether responsibility had become so diffused that no one, including the head of the institution, could be firmly held to account. As observers followed these exchanges, a broader question emerged almost naturally. If the NDPP cannot clearly articulate where responsibility lies within her own office, how can the public be expected to believe that accountability will be enforced beyond it, particularly against powerful individuals who have long seemed untouchable? The inquiry soon moved beyond individual answers and into patterns, with Justice Nkabinde highlighting recurring themes of missed deadlines, unexplained inertia, and a culture that appeared more reactive than decisive, a pattern that suggested deeper structural issues that leadership alone could not disown. Batohi's insistence on the independence of the prosecutorial authority, a principle enshrined in law and vital to democracy, was met with a subtle but firm reminder from the bench that independence does not equate to isolation from scrutiny, especially when independence is invoked without corresponding results. In one exchange that drew visible attention, the judge questioned whether the NDPP had sufficiently interrogated the performance of senior prosecutors under her leadership, a question that shifted focus from external pressures to internal management, and in doing so, reframed the narrative from one of inherited problems to one of ongoing stewardship. What made this moment particularly striking was the contrast between the promise that accompanied Batohi's appointment and the reality now under examination, because she had arrived with a mandate to clean house, to restore credibility, and to pursue accountability without fear or favor, a mandate that now seemed weighed down by unresolved expectations. As the inquiry pressed on, the language of reform gave way to the language of consequence, with Justice Nkabinde repeatedly steering the discussion back to outcomes, not intentions, subtly reinforcing the idea that good faith without tangible progress offers little comfort to a public waiting for justice. There was a palpable sense that this was no longer about defending past actions, but about confronting the limits of leadership in a deeply compromised institution, an institution that cannot afford ambiguity at the top if it hopes to regain public confidence. In addressing delays in high-profile prosecutions, Batohi referenced evidentiary challenges and the need for airtight cases, a familiar refrain, yet the judge's response underscored a growing impatience with explanations that have become almost routine in South Africa's justice discourse, explanations that sound reasonable yet yield little change. The inquiry thus became a mirror reflecting a broader national frustration, where process has often overshadowed progress, and where the promise of accountability has repeatedly been postponed in the name of thoroughness, a postponement that Justice Nkabinde seemed unwilling to accept without rigorous justification. As questioning deepened, moments of tension revealed themselves not through raised voices, but through pauses, clarifications, and repeated requests for specificity, each one peeling back another layer of institutional opacity that many believe has shielded underperformance for too long. It was during these exchanges that the phrase "torched" began circulating among observers, not because of theatrics, but because of the sustained pressure applied through disciplined, methodical inquiry that left little room for rhetorical escape. The focus then shifted subtly but decisively to oversight mechanisms within the NPA, with Justice Nkabinde probing whether the NDPP had effectively monitored case progression, or whether she had relied too heavily on reports filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy. This line of questioning struck at the heart of executive responsibility, because it suggested that leadership cannot merely receive information. It must interrogate it, challenge it, and act upon it decisively, especially in an institution tasked with enforcing the rule of law. As Batohi responded, there was a noticeable effort to balance candor with defense, to acknowledge shortcomings without conceding failure. Yet the judge's persistence made it clear that partial acknowledgments would not suffice in an inquiry designed to uncover systemic truth. Outside the hearing room, legal analysts and ordinary citizens alike began dissecting these moments, interpreting them as a sign that the era of deferential treatment toward powerful office holders might be waning, replaced by a more demanding standard of accountability. The inquiry's impact extended beyond Batohi herself, touching on the credibility of the NPA as a whole, because every question asked of the NDPP was, in effect, a question about whether the institution remains fit for purpose in a democracy still grappling with the legacy of state capture. As the proceedings moved into later stages, the emphasis turned toward consequences, not in the sense of punishment, but in terms of reform, with Justice Nkabinde's questioning implicitly asking whether lessons had been learned or whether the same patterns would persist under different justifications. This phase of the inquiry highlighted a critical tension between patience and urgency, between the legal system's need for precision and the public's demand for visible progress, a tension that Batohi was compelled to navigate under intense scrutiny. The discomfort was not limited to one side, because the inquiry also exposed the immense pressure placed on prosecutorial leadership in a politically charged environment, where every decision is dissected for motive as much as merit. Yet even this context did not soften the core message emerging from the bench. Leadership in such an environment requires not only resilience but clarity, decisiveness, and a willingness to confront internal weaknesses without deflection. As discussions turned to the future, the inquiry began to feel less like an autopsy of past failures and more like a crossroads, a moment where the direction of the NPA could be recalibrated if the lessons were taken seriously. Observers noted that Justice Nkabinde's approach was not about humiliation, but about illumination, forcing uncomfortable truths into the open so that they could no longer be ignored or explained away behind closed doors. By this stage, the narrative had shifted decisively, with Batohi no longer framed simply as a reformer facing resistance, but as a leader being asked to account for the tangible outcomes of her tenure, outcomes that remain uneven at best. The inquiry's closing phases underscored the idea that institutions are judged not by their stated values, but by their operational reality, a reality that must align with constitutional promises if trust is to be restored. In reflecting on the broader implications, it became evident that this moment would reverberate beyond one individual, shaping how future leaders of the NPA understand their mandate and the level of scrutiny that accompanies it. The final exchanges left a lingering sense of unfinished business, not because answers were entirely absent, but because the inquiry had opened questions that extend far beyond its immediate scope, questions about political will, institutional culture, and the true cost of delayed justice. As the proceedings drew toward their conclusion, the atmosphere was less charged but more contemplative, as if everyone present understood that what had transpired was not merely a confrontation, but a recalibration of expectations between the public and one of its most powerful legal institutions. The finishing point, then, was not a dramatic verdict or a definitive judgment, but a stark reminder that accountability is not a moment, it is a process, and that process had now been set firmly in motion, with advocate Shamila Batohi's tenure and the future of the NPA inseparably linked to the questions Justice Nkabinde had forced into the open.